Hi everyone. I'm going to go over a quick little mini lesson. This is going to look at all of the different tissue types. We're studying histology right now and looking at the different tissue types of the body. I'm going to share my screen. I want to look at this infographic that a colleague of mine made. It is set up in the way of it looks like a mind map that was created. And I often use mind maps to teach different concepts within anatomy and physiology because I think it's a good way to start breaking down and being able to organize thoughts, categorize things. And tissue types is a great way to this is a great way to study tissue types. So first, let's talk about the four main tissue types that we have inside of our body. So we have epithelial, connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissue. I'm going to touch quickly on each one, look at some key characteristics, talk about locations we find them. Remember, understanding tissues is going to be really important because it helps us understand how the structure functions. Because often the way that the tissues are organized, the way their cells are organized, is going to dictate how they can work or how they function. And so if we know that, we can understand how things work, and then we can also understand pathologies a little bit easier. So the first thing we're going to start with are these epithelial tissues. So these are all these ones at the very top. Epithelial tissues are going to be found in places that cover surfaces. It's going to line the inside of cavities, and it's also going to form glands. So the key feature about epithelial tissues is cellularity. All of these cells here are going to be tightly packed. We don't find a lot of extracellular matrix found within here, so cell to cell is how we're going to find these. And we're going to classify them based on two different criterion. So we're going to look at either the cell shape and the number of layers, and that's how we'll name them. And so we often say if it's one layer, we will say simple. If it is multiple layers, we say that something is stratified. Okay, so that is how we name the layers. And then after that, we name it. The second word is based on the cell shape. So let's look at each of these. So this very first one on the top left here is squamous. And the word squamous reminds me, it is similar to the word squashed. So we see squamous up here. So squashed is what you're thinking, which means it's flattened. Now, I mentioned that often we can figure out the function based on the shape of these. Well, squamous is very thin and flattened. That means we can push things across or diffuse things across this membrane very easily. And so it makes this tissue ideal for diffusion. So one of the features that or a place we would find this is going to be places like the alveoli inside of the lung. Remember, gas exchange is going to happen inside of the lungs. And so being able to exchange gas, a very thin tissue, is going to be ideal. So squamous cells, we often see them, and we see them there. We would call these simple squamous because this is one layer thick, and it is those shaped cells that we find there. Okay. The next one we are going to look at is going to be cuboidal. And so we have cuboidal here. And we could have simple cuboidal, or we could have stratified cuboidal. Cuboidal shapes are tissues. I can't speak this morning. Cuboidal tissues are going to be cubed in shape. These are often involved in secretion and absorption. So we're going to find this in places like the kidney tubules. The next one is going to be columnar. And so that's up over here. You see columnar. And columnar cells are going to be shaped like a column. So they're kind of tall. We often find microvilli in here. And these are like finger-like projections that are going to increase the surface area. So if we think of a string stretched out flat, right? And it takes up a lot of space if we stretch out that string end to end. If we crunch that string up, we don't take up as much space, right? But we have like little loops in there. Well, that's kind of like the microvilli. And so we are increasing surface area. So we will do this in places where we need to pack a lot of things in one area, but be able to have a lot of function or absorption or secretion across those membranes. And so that's where we find them, in places like the kidney tubules. So that was, let's see, columnar, right? So we have that. Another place we would see that is where we do a lot of absorption, and that is in the intestines, right? We are going to absorb the nutrients we take in places like the small intestine. So we also see these type of cells there. So here is a pseudostratified. So this is another category, and pseudo means fake, and so it's fake stratified, which means it's saying that essentially there are fake multiple layers, which really means it's just a single layer. But the way that the cells are sort of spread out and the locations of the nuclei in it gives an appearance as if it were to be multiple layers. So we find these cells often in places like the trachea. They are often ciliated. So they are going to, it's a little bit different than how we see that brush border of the intestines with those microvilli, but these are going to have these little finger-like projections that are going to help move things. And so we're going to find it in places where we have mucus, for example. We often see things like goblet cells here, which are going to produce mucus found inside there. And it's going to be in places where we need things to move along and where mucus would be helpful, which also has sort of some immune properties to it. And so we are going to find it in places like the trachea. All right, so next one, let's move on. Let's see, what else do I have? We talked about stratified, and that's multiple layers. We talked about simple being one layer. Now let's look at transitional. And transitional is going to be a little bit different in that it has the ability to stretch and recoil. So kind of like a rubber band, being able to stretch out and come back. And we find this in places where tissues need to expand and come back. So places like the bladder, right, fills up sort of like a balloon and comes back together. So we see transitional tissues found in places like that. So these are all of the epithelial. So let's move on to connective tissue. Connective tissue, so unlike epithelium, connective tissue has a lot of extracellular matrix, which is going to help determine its properties. Different cells are going to be embedded within the matrix, and all these cells have functions, and they act sort of as support for the tissue in that area. So let's look at each of these. So this first one up here is areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is what we call a loose connective tissue. So we have both dense and loose connective tissue, but this falls under loose, so an areolar tissue. And it is going to provide support and flexibility, and we typically find it under the epithelial tissue. So it's a support type tissue. I always tell students connective kind of does that. It connects tissues together. So it is sort of that supportive tissue, and we find it in underneath some of the other tissues, helping connect things together. The next one is adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is comprised of fat cells or adipocytes. These are going to be good for us and helpful because it's, one, going to provide insulation, but it also helps store energy in the form of fats, which we can break down and make ATP out of. And so that is our adipose tissue. And adipose tissue, easy to identify because it's these big white globs packed together, so very big cells, and so it kind of looks fatty in nature. That's our adipose tissue. Dense connective tissue. This is going to have a lot of collagen fibers found within inside of it. Anywhere we have collagen, we're going to see a lot of strength. So we're going to find dense connective tissue in places where we need a lot of strength. So places like our tendons and ligaments. Tendons are what connect muscle to bone. And then ligaments are going to be where or how we connect bone to bone and provide structure and support. So that is going to be our dense connective tissue, and it looks really dense when we look at it. Okay. The next one is reticular, and this reticular fibers, so let me click on here really quick. Reticular fibers we see right here, and reticular has a very distinctive look to it as well. These reticular fibers are going to also provide support to the body, so in organs like the spleen and the lymph nodes. And if you ever get a chance to dissect a spleen or look at a cross section, this really looks a lot like those tissues that we see there. So reticular fibers found there. So spleen, lymph nodes. The next one is cartilage, and cartilage is important for us because it's going to provide support and flexibility. We see hyaline cartilage inside our joints and elastic cartilage in places like our ear, and then fibrocartilage we find in the intervertebral discs. So these are our different cartilages that we see here. So hyaline, elastic, fibrocartilage. Okay, so that's where we found them. So joints for hyaline, elastic, move this over for me so I can see it better. Elastic cartilage, places like the ear, and fibrocartilage, places like the intervertebral discs, which are the discs between that provide cushion, nutrient support to the vertebrae. So we find these inside of the vertebrae. All right, the next one let's look at is going to be part of our connective tissue, but special. So this is going to be our bone and blood. Bone is easy to identify. Here's bone. Bone has these concentric rings around it. There are little pathways. We find lacunae in here. We find what we call haversian canals, and the bone sort of looks like a cross section of the concentric rings of a tree. And the structure or the way that these cells are made and the way that they're laid down provide and make it a very strong supportive tissue. And so obviously our bones need to be strong. And so their layout is kind of conducive to that. The next thing let's look at. Blood. So blood found obviously the fluid that is responsible for transporting nutrients for us, specifically looking at things like oxygen and its importance to carry that, and also to help transport waste for us. So blood, obviously an important tissue for us, but blood is also pretty easy to identify because it looks like little blood cells. So that is our blood. All right, let's move on to our next category, and that's muscle tissue. Now, muscle is responsible for movement, whether we're talking about like our bicep or we're talking about muscles inside our organs or in places like our heart. And so we have three main categories based on where we find them. One is going to be skeletal, and this is responsible for the body's movement. Skeletal muscle. All three of these muscles do look very different from one another, but all of them are cardiac and skeletal have similarities in that they are both striated. Smooth muscle, it's not striated, so that's one of the differences with inside the skeletal muscles. So these are the muscles we are moving, right? So like our bicep muscle is here, and this is voluntary because we're choosing to control it. And this is what attaches to bones and allows us to move. So the next one, let's talk about cardiac. So here's cardiac, and we find this only inside of our heart, and they are striated fibers also. But we find different things here, like intercalated discs, and we see these little lines that go perpendicular to the striations, and these are responsible for allowing all of the fibers to contract at once, which is important when we're talking about the contraction of the heart, because it has to work really in sync with itself to push that blood around our body. And so that's the cardiac. Make sure you're looking at the differences between skeletal and cardiac muscles and noting the differences of striations, the different structures we find inside of those, because that's going to be important. And now we look at the smooth muscle. Smooth muscle looks smooth. And we're going to find this in places like the walls of our internal organs. I can't speak. The walls of our internal organs. So they are smooth, which means also because we find them in our internal organs, we're not controlling this. We don't have to think about contracting these muscles. So we find these smooth muscles in places like our digestive tract, right? Our digestive tract helps move things along. And that's sort of some of the roles for them. So movement of our organs. Let's see. So finally, nervous tissue. So this is the last piece is our nervous tissue. We kind of divide this into two different categories. We have our neurons. The neurons are the excitable cells. These are ones that can propagate a signal and move things along. These are the ones that we don't very easily remake. They are highly metabolic. When I say remake, they don't regenerate themselves very well when we injure them. This is why when there are things like spinal cord injuries, we often see long-term impairments from that. Or dysfunction we start seeing if we have any injury to them. It's hard for us to regrow that. On the flip side of that, we have neuroglia. And neuroglia cells or tissues are all about support and protection of the neurons. And so they both work really well and tightly together. There is a lot of importance in the neuroglia cells. So we find that nervous tissue throughout the body, but concentrated in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. So that's the nervous tissue. So that's the four main types of tissues. If you have any further questions, make sure you come to open office hours. That's posted inside of the syllabus and also in the announcements. Go ahead and shoot me an email if you have questions. But outside of that, happy studying.